Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank my colleague from New Hampshire. I think as we begin to have this broader discussion and as we begin to explore the kind of paths that other projects like this, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's sexual assault and changing outcomes, we know the first obstacle is awareness. The first thing that we need to do is take these horrible issues, these dark blotches in our society out of the shadows and into the light, and develop a plan and a strategy that will not only deal appropriately with the law enforcement components of prosecuting and finding appropriate, I think, penalties for people who engage in modern-day slavery. I think that it's important that we look to prevention. And so I want to first take this opportunity to thank the senior senator from Maryland, Senator Barbara Mikulski, for not only bringing together several of the Senate women today who are coming to the floor to calling for action to stop the scourge of human trafficking, but also for her long-term commitment to women and children and society's most vulnerable. I think we all know that she has stood tall, which for a woman of her stature is always a little tough. She has stood tall for those who have no voice in society, and for those who are engaged in some of the most horrible victimization that we can imagine, which today is the victimization of sexual human trafficking. And so as the senator from New Hampshire has talked about, as the former Attorney General of North Dakota, I think I know how difficult it is to shine a light on a problem that most people don't recognize or are really, unfortunately, unwilling to admit is a problem. You know, when we began in the 1990s talking about a different strategy to combat violence against women and domestic violence, that's an issue that had lurked in the shadows. In fact, for many states, that was an issue that was considered a public health issue, not a criminal justice issue. I, along with a number of my women colleagues who were elected Attorney General, along with this body and most notably now Vice President Joe Biden, began to have an ongoing discussion about the Violence Against Women Act and what we needed to do to not only protect victims but change the dynamic. I think that as we began to take that problem out of the shadows, as we began to address the concerns of so many women who for years, literally years, had been victimized in their home, in a place that should be the safest place for human beings, we were able to build awareness and change outcomes. And there is still a lot of work to do in domestic violence, but we believe that great strides were made simply because we were willing to point the finger and shine the light and say this is not acceptable in our society. I see a lot of similarities in this fight that we're waging today against human trafficking, and with the right strategy, the right partners, the right policies, and persistence, we're going to turn the tide on human trafficking. While there continues to be so much time and attention focused on intervention and recovery, and I think that's rightfully so, and criminal prosecution, I'd like to just take my time today to talk about preventing human trafficking in the first place. And the senator from the state of New Hampshire, as she discussed the bills that are addressing this, the homeless youth bill is absolutely critical to being a point of intervention to prevent children from being on the streets, being extremely vulnerable to victimization, being extremely vulnerable to traffickers, by helping those children off the street, by beginning to address the issues in their home that led them to flee in the first place. I think that's a very important first step to preventing human trafficking and human sex trafficking among minors. I also think it's important that we learn from the experiences of other places. Last year, I traveled to Mexico City with Senator Klobuchar, who, as you know, has been a fierce advocate and a wonderful partner on this issue, beginning not only with her work in the United States Senate, but her work as the Hennepin County District Attorney. County attorney, and I also traveled there with Cindy McCain, and I think we would be remiss if we did not raise her voice and her name in this body today. She has been a global leader and a tireless leader, working not only in her state of Arizona, but all across the globe. She has stood up to people who say this is not a problem. She has stood up to people who would just as soon sweep this under the rug and forget that it's happening. She has been a leader and a champion of not only the people in her state and the women and children of this country, but the women and children of the world. And I'm proud of our association, and I'm proud of our friendship and the work that we've been able to do together. When we went to Mexico, we heard from countless government officials and NGOs about the difficulties that they face stopping this unspeakable crime. And what I was particularly struck by were the stories of women and children coerced into this life, not forcefully, not grab them off the street against their will, but forced and coerced through promises of better life, the promises of someone to love and care for them. These promises, unfortunately, for many of these young girls were short-lived because these girls and women are quickly pushed into a world of physical abuse, drug use, forced sex with hundreds, if not thousands of men. And what was once a promise of a better life is a nightmare, relived countless times a day as these victims are sold time and time again. Their value now strictly as a commodity to be constantly traded over and over again. Imagine the horror of their life. Imagine the horror of their existence. So how do we prevent this from happening? We must make sure to work with survivors. We must ask survivors to go to communities, go to vulnerable populations, and tell their stories. The women and children who are most vulnerable and most susceptible need to hear firsthand the tactics used and, most importantly, the reality of following these false promises. Shortly after returning from Mexico City, I met with Madra Morales Albino from Mexico. She's an amazing survivor of human trafficking. She was sexually exploited for 2 years, and she successfully escaped and then was transported from Mexico to New York City. She's now an activist, and she talks about her experience and helps to teach and prevent this crime among the youth. She's become a role model for the younger girls at the shelter where she was cared for in Mexico. She attends national and international forums and workshops as a speaker to talk about her experience and talk about the horror of human trafficking. She is currently studying to become a lawyer so she can continue to help girls who are now trapped in human trafficking. The strength and courage of this young woman is awe-inspiring, and she is changing outcomes. We need more of her in the world. We need more of her courage in the world, the courage to tell her story, and then the courage to reach out and relive that horror through telling that story every day, the horror that was her existence. We must also bring hope to the hopeless. Love to those who do not feel loved. We can do this through increased educational opportunities, increased job opportunities, providing the necessary social service infrastructure, and working to build a safer, stronger community overall for women and children around the world. Most importantly, what we should bring to this is not judgment. Not judgment. Instead, bring a helping hand, bring an opportunity for a new life. Whether we're talking about the streets of Mexico City, Baltimore, or Indian country in North Dakota, we can and we must do better. And we can start taking action immediately here in the United States Senate. We can directly impact efforts to prevent human trafficking here in the United States by providing the resources necessary to work with some of our most vulnerable and most susceptible, our runaway and homeless youth. I urge the Majority Leader to bring forward S-262, the Runaway and Homeless Youth and Human Trafficking Prevention Act, a bill championed by my great friend, Senator Leahy. We all recognize that homeless youth are some of, if not the most vulnerable and susceptible to trafficking. This is certainly true in North Dakota. It's certainly true in Mexico City, and I'm certain it's true in every community where runaway and homeless youth exist. This bill would provide much-needed resources to this population and would complement other anti-trafficking legislation being addressed here that addresses prevention, intervention, and recovery services to victims. I also call on the Majority Leader to act by urging him to also bring S-166, the Stop Exploitation Through Trafficking Act, and S-178, the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, to the floor for a vote. I have worked tirelessly to push both of those bills since last Congress. The Judiciary Committee reported 2 bills out of the committee last week with unanimous support, and it's time to bring those bills to the floor. I believe all 3 bills should be part of a comprehensive approach to preventing trafficking and supporting victims. We must and can do everything that we can in our power to stamp out human sex trafficking in our backyard and across the country and across the world. With that, I yield the floor to my great friend from the great state of New York.